What is the scariest folklore story you have ever heard? Story 1. An old Japanese lady told me this story. If you have two mirrors facing each other so the reflections make a tunnel, then you light a candle between them. If you look down the tunnel, you will see a demon putting out the candle in the mirrors as it gets closer by jumping forward one reflection every time you look away. If it reaches you, it grabs you and pulls you into the mirror to become a demon yourself and then drag the next victim in. Story 2. Our village has one called Bilas. What makes it creepy is that she is not some obscure or unidentified being. People actually know women who are called Bilas, and they have normal families and everyday lives. So she is literally living amongst you. She stalks people at night, usually appearing in a ghoulish form with her feet turned backwards. She becomes sick a day before someone in the area is about to die, and then appears very healthy on the day they do die. She can transform into different creatures and attack you when you're alone, causing you to fall ill. If she visits you in her human form while you are sick, you will die, and you cannot refuse her from coming in. It sounds silly, and in many ways it is, but it is still unsettling. And then there is another one about the music of the dead. Our traditional music has flutes and some forms of drums. It is said that people sometimes hear the music from a distance, but the flute will always be missing. You are supposed to ignore it because it is believed to be the music of the dead or otherworldly beings. If you do not ignore it, they will notice you too. We have many strange stories like that, but I guess people had to come up with good tales to keep themselves entertained. Story 3. When I lived in an Australian outback town in the middle of nowhere, our Indigenous studies teacher, who was Aboriginal, loved to tell us stories. She scared all the first graders by warning us never to go out into the desert alone, because there lives a monster who is always thirsty. He is constantly searching for water, but can never find it because it hardly rains. So when children become lost in the desert, he jumps on them and drinks all their blood. All he leaves behind are dry husks for their parents to find. I am sure she was just trying to deter us from wandering off into the bushland, but it left a lasting impression. I have forgotten the monster's name. Another popular Aboriginal tale is about Tidalik. Tidalik was a giant frog who drank all the water in the world. As the other creatures began to die of thirst, they plotted to make Tidalik laugh. Everyone failed except Nabunum, the eel, who danced and tied himself into knots. Tidalik laughed so hard that he released all the water, filling the rivers and lakes. Many of the creatures drowned in the process or were left stranded on new islands. The idea of a giant laughing frog terrified me as a 6-year-old. Story 4. An English village near me has a large old mansion owned by a local family. Most of the rooms in the mansion have not been touched for years, partly because of the size of the house, and partly because the family refuses to go into them due to hauntings. The house apparently dates back to before the English Civil War, and the family living there were a well-known Catholic family, so of course it became a base for the king's soldiers, the Cavaliers. The king lost the Civil War, and the family who still live there say they can hear the soldiers stomping around the hallways at night and occasionally barking orders. They also claim there are many other ghosts, such as a veiled woman in black who only appears if you are ill in that house, a librarian who will shush people talking in the library room, a young girl you can only see through some of the frosted glass doors, banging noises and screaming coming from the sitting room at night, and finally a man dressed in black who wanders the gardens at midday. And these are just a few of the tales I remember. Even if you do not believe in the ghosts, there are still plenty of unsettling things about that house, such as tiny hidden rooms for priests to hide in, known as priest holes, a hidden room below the house that leads out to a nearby river, and secret passageways all around the mansion. Story 5. This was not folklore, but my friend's uncle told us a story that has creeped me out ever since I heard it. He was telling us how he used to work on a large farm in Mexico when he was younger, and he had only been there for about 2 months. At one end of the farm was an older house with dark trees all around it, and he noticed that the animals never went to that side. He would always see someone walking back and forth at the edge of the fence as if they wanted in. One day the animals went to that side, so he went over there too, and he could see the figure moving back and forth. As he got closer, he noticed it was a woman because her hair was very long and hung in front of her face. As he walked up to introduce himself, Her head shot up and she stared at him with completely black eyes. He said her face resembled a horse's because it was so long and disfigured. As he backed away, she started to climb the fence and then chased him. She pursued him all the way to his house, which was about 1 mile away. He never went back to work. Story 6. I was reading a book on Finnish folklore and was surprised when the most brutal story was about tontus, which are gnomes, elves, or homekeepers. In the modern world, they are often described in an affectionate way, but they used to be considered malevolent beings. People believed in tontus for a very long time, and it was said they only really disappeared alongside electric lighting in households because there were no more dark corners for them to hide in. They were described as frightening creatures, sometimes originating from the spirits of previous dead owners of the house. Tontus kept the house safe and thriving as long as you left them food and, in this story, the last session of the sauna. You were not supposed to go to the sauna after midnight because that was when it was Tontu's turn. There was a stubborn young woman who ignored this rule and decided to go anyway. Everyone warned her not to, but she did not listen. Time passed and there was no word from her, so people went to check if she was still in there. All that was left was her flayed skin hanging on a perch. Some traditionally creepier beings were lekyus, the lost souls of children buried and hidden in the woods after childbirth without a christening. They scared people by crying and screaming, but sometimes they were helpful and pointed out trees about to fall. Sometimes they were described the same way as vervatili, will-o'-the-wisp, luring people deeper into bogs and forests. Painajainen, also the Finnish word for nightmare, literally translated as the one who presses, was a creature who sat on a sleeping person's chest, caused bad dreams, and terrified them. Later it was determined that this was an explanation for sleep paralysis. Story 7. England has a very old legend about a spirit called the Wild Hunt. Essentially, it is a group of spirits led by the Reaper himself, driving a large black carriage pulled by 4 black draft horses. They travel the English countryside seeking out lost souls or wanderers who have lost their way. When they find someone, the hunt begins, ending with the lost soul being captured and either conscripted into the hunt for eternity or dragged to the underworld. My story. When I was about 12 years old, I had a deep passion for reading and learning everything I could about ghosts and the paranormal. Every time I visited the library, I would come home with at least 3 or 4 books on the subject. One night I had the most vivid dream I have ever experienced, and it was also the last dream I ever remembered having. I am 42 years old now. In the dream, I was riding in the back of a cab down a dark country road at night, with trees stretching overhead like a canopy. For some reason, I knew I was in England, even though I am from the United States and had never been there. The cab approached a curve in the road, beyond which there was an unnatural light. As we made the curve, there stood an old man in the road with a lantern screaming, "Turn back, turn back." I laughed and told the driver to continue, which he did. As we passed, the old man disappeared. A bit later, we approached another curve, again with an unnatural light. I felt butterflies in my gut telling me something was wrong. As we rounded the bend, blocking the road was an enormous black carriage lit by 4 torches at the corners and pulled by 4 massive black horses. Fog was so thick at ground level that I could not see their hooves. Panic rose in me, and I looked out the window to the left. To my horror, an army of the dead was rising out of the fog. I turned back to the driver and begged him to get us out of there, but when he looked back at me, half his face was missing. Immediately, I flung open the car door and jumped out. The last thing I remember was a skeletal hand grabbing my shoulder. I woke up drenched in sweat with a scream caught in my throat, certain I had just died in my dream. The disturbing part is that I knew nothing about the Wild Hunt until a week later when I came across the legend in one of the old books I brought home from the library. I still cannot remember the title, but it was an old volume about ghosts and legends from England. It still freaks me out, and it is also strange how I have not been able to recall a single dream since. Story 8. On the Big Island of Hawaii, there are the Night Marchers, which are the ghosts of the cow warriors who died in a volcanic eruption after a battle. Their footprints are still preserved in Kilauea National Park. I have had many people, both locals and visitors from the mainland, tell me about hearing a large group of men marching and chanting late at night around Kau. You supposedly smell sulfur, and some say you have to get naked and lay in the fetal position. Others say you just cannot look at them, and if you do, you will die. I have had friends tell me they were camping in a remote valley when they heard about 20 people march by speaking Hawaiian and smelled sulfur, though they never saw anyone since they were inside a tent. I also had an old Hawaiian uncle tell me that when he was a teenager working on a ranch at night, he saw a purple light go from Kalawea to Mauna Loa, and the next day Mauna Loa erupted for the first time in a while. This was sometime in the 1980s. Story 9. This one I heard at Sapfest, harvesting maple sap in northern Wisconsin. I am not sure if it is well known since I only ever heard it from my family. It is called The Buried Boy, and it came from a song we sing during Sapfest. It is basically about a man sitting on the riverbank with his sweetheart, talking about his older brother who was murdered and buried by their father. According to the story, the older brother rose up that night and killed his father as payback. But his eyes had already been eaten by birds, so he did not see that his father was dead. He kept wandering around searching for his father in order to kill him. He wanders through the woods looking for his father to get revenge, banging on the doors and windows of log cabins. And if he finds them open, he comes in and murders everyone. If you pass by his grave across the riverbank, as the song goes, he will know and stalk you through the trees. It might not sound frightening in a city, but when you are separated from everyone in the woods and the sun is setting, or when you are trying to sleep and the wind bangs against the door, it becomes a lot scarier. I still do not like crossing rivers at night, even in a car over a bridge. Storytime. Some of the indigenous Australian dreaming tales are terrifying. My father told us about the Kadicha man, a man like the rest of us but righteous to the point that he has excess skills far beyond the best of us. As a result of this power, he is imbued with the role of both punisher and healer. Some of his skills include leaving no tracks, traveling faster and better than anyone else, and being able to sing you to death. If you have chosen to do wrong, you might be punished with a spear through the right thigh, although he could also spear you anywhere, with knowledge of how to wound you fatally or not. Out of fear, you may think to yourself that you can outrun him, since he is just a man. So you leave carefully, covering your tracks, moving for a whole day through creeks and rivers, over and around hills, doing everything to evade him. But every time you stop, there he is, already standing and waiting, not tired, not thirsty, not hungry. He waits until you cannot run anymore, and then you must admit to yourself that you have to take the punishment, just as you chose to do the wrong thing. I was very frightened of the Kadicha man when I was young, and even now, as a middle-aged woman, I would never want him after me because there is no avoiding him. Story 11. The Santa Campana from Galicia in northwestern Spain is a procession of dead souls that roams the forest on winter nights. You can see their faint outlines in the fog, and they are led by a living person carrying a lit candle and a cauldron. This person has been cursed into leading them and spends the nights roaming the countryside until they die of exhaustion, since they remember nothing when they wake up in their beds the next morning. The only way for a cursed person to lift the burden is to run into another living person and pass them the candle and cauldron. If you encounter the Santa Campana, there are a few things you can do to avoid being cursed, such as entering a church or drawing a circle around yourself with an olive tree branch. When I was a child and went for walks late in the evening, my grandmother would remind me to grab an olive stalk and carry it with me in case I met them. There are also the Madamas, evil spirits in the form of impossibly beautiful women who live in caves underground protecting treasures. If you go to a cave where a Madama lives at dawn, you may see her come out with a comb to brush her long blonde hair. She will ask you to come with her and become her husband underground, but you must refuse, because those who know the legend say her beautiful comb is made of human bone. Story 12. Easily the Yinald Lushi, or skinwalkers. It translates roughly to, by this way, they travel on four legs. It is one of the four witching ways, alongside the frenzy way, the wizardry way, and the sorcery way. The origins of the legend extend back to their emergence from the flood of the third world into the fourth world, or the world as we know it. Having left their creators behind in the flood and saved by the children of the ants, the Dene, the people, had lost much of the wisdom of how to live. They prayed for guidance, performed dances, and carried out ceremonies, and they were answered by the holy people of the sky. These holy people had lived here before and were wise, knowing how to live in harmony with Mother Earth and Father Sky. They taught the Dene, who came from the ground and were called the ground people, the brighter shining ways, which eventually made up the Navajo way. Those who were blessed by the land and the gods were taught special knowledge of medicine and magic to be used for the good of the people. However, some of the holy people became jealous of what was being shared and of what the Dene brought from the worlds below, and so they taught ways of corruption. Those became the ways of the Navajo witch, the most well-known being the witchery way, whose practitioners became Yi-Nald-Lushi. These were medicine men and women who had originally been taught the ways to guard against witchcraft, but they fell into corruption. While medicine is still practiced on the reservations, so too is the belief that witchcraft endures, and while there are proud families of medicine men, there are also secret families of witches passing down the witching ways through generations. Skinwalkers are said to be able to change into any animal form they desire to suit their needs. They can run as fast as cars and are reputed to be strong enough to break stone. Looking into a skinwalker's eyes is said to paralyze you and inflict sickness. Abductions of children and family members are attributed to them, and some say that the final ceremony to become one involves murdering a family member or close friend. To the Navajo, this is not folklore. They take it with deadly seriousness and generally refuse to speak about it to outsiders, likely because they do not want to draw attention onto themselves. Story 13. There is a place I visit when I spend time with my grandparents in Colombia. It is called Puerto Colombia, or Sabanilla, to the locals, and to get there you must take a narrow two-lane highway. My grandfather would tell my brothers and me stories about the region, and my favorite was the tale of the woman in white. He told me that one weekend in his youth, in his early 20s, this was in the mid-1940s, he needed to make a trip to Sabanilla to pick up supplies for his father's factory. He left in the morning, arrived at the pickup site, stayed for lunch, and caught up with the production workers. On his drive back home, however, things became strange. He got back on the highway near evening, and you can imagine how dark that road was in the 1940s. He described barely being able to see the road ahead of him when, as he rounded a bend, something in his headlights made him freeze. He saw a woman standing on the side of the road, the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, wearing a simple white dress that seemed to glow. He stopped his car and asked if she needed help. She did not say anything, but walked to the truck and opened the door. He calmly let her in, and she sat beside him. He felt dread because, as a boy, he had heard the stories, and he knew he had to be cautious. He asked her, "Where to, miss?" She spoke softly, just enough for him to hear where she wished to go, but then she remained silent, staring at him. He kept his composure and drove her. About 90 minutes later, he dropped her off, and when he pulled away and looked in his mirrors, she was gone. La Mujer de Blanco had disappeared. My grandfather said the legend goes that she presents herself to lone men traveling that highway at night. He was never sure if she was a ghost or a demon, but she has one request: a ride to a church. You must take her, because if you refuse or try to take advantage of her silence, it ends terribly. He said dozens of men had been found killed in their cars on that highway, in brutal ways. Many others reported safely taking her to the church in town. The story people tell is that she had been on her way to be married on that road, before it was a highway, heading to Sabanilla, when she was abducted by road bandits and killed horrifically. That is why she appears, exacting revenge on the unworthy men who come across her. Story 14. Leshy are basically forest protectors, the Slavic version of the Lorax. They kind of just hang out with the animals when they migrate. Leshy can shapeshift into many different forms. As a human, a Leshy looks like a poor person, with glowing eyes, and his shoes are on backwards. If you become friends with a Leshy, you can learn the secrets of magic. Farmers and shepherds would make pacts with Leshy to protect their crops and sheep. The Leshy likes to trick people just to mess with them. He lures people into getting lost, makes them sick, or his favorite, tickles them to death. He also hates axes and will look for them and hide them in his lair. If a person gets lost in the woods and a Leshy crosses their path, you must turn your clothes inside out and wear your shoes on the opposite feet. If you do not, the lessee will tickle you to death. Lessee are very mischievous creatures. They have horrid screams like a fisher cat and can imitate the voices of people to trick lost travelers in the forest. They use those voices to lure people back to their caves, where a lessee will tickle them to death. They also remove signs from posts just to make sure people get lost. Lessee are not totally evil, although they enjoy misleading humans and sometimes kidnapping young women. They love animals, so they often keep grazing cattle from wandering too far into the forest and getting lost or eaten. Sometimes cowherds will make deals with a lessee by handing him a cross and sharing communion with the lessee after Christian church gatherings. Those deals are said to grant the cowherds special powers. This story from my Babshia, my grandmother, kept me out of forests as a kid. Being tickled to death sounds horrid. Story 15. The mini lights have been an urban legend among the African American community here for a while. Around Childs Park and Brooker Creek, it is said that if any children are out past dark, the mini lights, large green orbs of light, would come out and kill them. The lights were said to be the spirits of two dwarves that stayed behind with Minnie when P.T. Barnum and Bailey blew through town somewhere in the early 1900s. Minnie was the name of an old woman said to be a witch who somehow inherited the land despite being a newly freed slave, so understandably, people were suspicious. Rumors circulated that Minnie had access to black magic, further alienating the old woman. It was said that Minnie never liked people poking around her property and often sent out her little men to chase off anyone who trespassed. This continued every day until old Minnie's death, and that was the legend. The truth is that long ago, the Brooker Creek and Childs Park area had been home to many newly freed slaves after the war. But just because a law passed did not mean that everything was safe. Hunting alligators was a pastime that netted big money for alligator skin, heads, and meat, especially during the growth of the tourism businesses in the early 1900s. Hunting alligators was no easy task. You needed guns, hunting dogs, and a kerosene lamp to find the gators as their eyes shone in the dark. Goats, sheep, and farm animals were used as bait, often tied at the riverbank. But that could get expensive, so sometimes hunters improvised, and if they had little regard for other human beings, bait was plentiful. Raids into the African American settlements were frequent. Hunters waited until after dark and sent out their hounds looking to grab anyone they could drag off, the easiest being children. For generations, children were warned not to be out past dark unless they wanted to disappear. Nearly 100 years later, the legend of Minnie's lights served to scare children back indoors to avoid being victims of hate crimes. But sometimes legends take on a life of their own. And to this day, people in those communities still claim to have seen the Minnie lights. Story 16. This one only became creepy for me because of a coincidental experience I had related to it. There are legends of a creature called Black Shuck, or more generally, the Hellhound. Most legends say that you will die a horrible death if you see it 3 times. Basically, it is a large black dog with glowing red eyes. I first learned of it from an old Animal Planet show called Lost Tapes, which was basically the Blair Witch Project, but with cryptids. Several years ago on New Year's Eve, all the adults in the family dropped the kids off at our house so they could go down the street for an adults-only party. While most of my cousins were playing in my sister's room, a couple of us were in the living room playing video games. At one point, I heard my dog scratching at the door to come back inside, so I got up to let her in. She bolted past me to the other end of the house, so I looked back outside, thinking she had been spooked by a raccoon or something. What I actually saw was an enormous dog covered with long dark hair walking around the back of the yard. This thing was easily twice the size of our dog, a golden retriever. Needless to say, my cousins and I freaked out and started yelling, which I guess spooked the huge dog as well, and it proceeded to leap over the fence in one bound. We were shaken and worried for my dog's safety, but thankfully she was unhurt, and I did not think much more of the event. That is, until I saw this dog a second time less than 1 week later while walking home from a friend's house late one night. Seeing it froze me in my tracks for a good minute. Thankfully, it was far away and wandered off in the opposite direction of my house. Roughly 1 month after this, the Lost Tapes episode about hellhounds premiered. Nobody ever figured out what happened to the dog because we never saw it again after that. Story 17. My parents have some pretty chilling stories. Both are Haitian, and these took place in Haiti. My father was never the type to believe in paranormal things. He is not even religious. There are always stories about voodoo priests being able to hypnotize people, which he attributes to devil's breath. But there was one night that he has never been able to explain. There was a house with farmland behind it, and he and his 17 brothers and sisters were always told never to talk to the people inside. One night, coming home from a party with a bit of a buzz, he saw someone standing on the porch. Out of politeness, he wished her a good evening. She did not reply, and he felt a little offended. But then he found himself staring into the farm behind the house. He definitely saw a group of people working the land, and when one looked up at him, their eyes were glowing red. My father's older brother caught him staring and began frantically yelling for him to run. That snapped him out of his trance, and he bolted. He has tried many times to explain what he saw or piece it together, but he never could. The story that really unsettles me is my mother's. My uncle, her youngest brother, had a string of illnesses when he was very young, maybe around 3 years old. One sickness was so severe that my grandparents took him to several hospitals, but none of them could pinpoint what was making him so ill. He must have been close to death because my family finally decided to bring in a voodoo doctor. The doctor told everyone in the house to wear red, and the children were separated from the room where my uncle lay. My mother does not remember much about the ritual, but she distinctly recalls hearing a male voice from my uncle's room scream, "I am leaving." After that, he was completely fine. He grew up healthy, and now, at age 50, he looks like he is 30. Story 18. I am from Newfoundland, on Canada's east coast, and here we have a lot of lore about fairies. These are not your flower-dwelling, woodland sprite, Tinkerbell fairies. These are dangerous beings. They are always described as very small men wearing old, ragged clothing. I have collected many stories about them from books around the province and from people's personal experiences. The most common tales are about being fairy-led. Since this province has such a harsh environment, people go berry picking in late summer to stock up for winter, and they have been doing this for decades. There are many tales of people going out in the morning and expected back by early afternoon, but instead going missing until late evening, or sometimes not returning for several days or even weeks. One account I read told of a girl who sensed something strange in the barrens, noticing the sun had been high in the sky for far too long. She waved her red jacket, and suddenly the spell broke. It was evening, and people were out searching for her. Others have come home thinking they were gone for only a few hours, when in fact they had been missing for days with no memory of where they had been. According to our lore, wearing red can protect you from fairies. Other protections include turning your clothes inside out or carrying breadcrumbs or silver coins to offer them in exchange for your freedom. When I was a child, I always slept with my socks inside out whenever we stayed at my father's cabin in the woods, which is exactly the kind of place fairies were said to inhabit. One night I swore I heard footsteps on the ceiling, but it turned out to be a caribou walking on the boardwalk outside. There are also stories of fairies confronting people on the road, leaping toward them, punching their skin, and pulling out pieces of straw. Afterward, a hole would be left behind, and some people were crippled for life because of it. My uncle told me that when he was a child, he was running on a trail behind my grandparents' house when he saw a small humanoid running alongside him. It turned and looked at him, and he said it was the same size as him, about 6 years old, but with the face of an older person, green-tinged skin, and black eyes. He stopped, and it stopped too. When he looked back down the trail, the sun suddenly dropped in the sky. It was evening, not just before noon as it had been seconds earlier. He heard my grandparents calling his name. He had been gone all day. A few months later, he woke to see the same figure standing at the foot of his bed, silently watching him. He did not feel threatened and went back to sleep. He forgot about it until years later, walking past a bookstore in Toronto, when he saw the exact same figure illustrated on the cover of a book about UFOs and folklore. That freaked me out, though he never seemed bothered by it himself. I have plenty more stories like these, but I will stop here. Story 19. I do not know that this is folklore per se, but it is an old story and it gave me the willies. This may be a little fuzzy because it has been years since I read it. The tale goes that a family living out in the mountains went on a hunt, saw a pair of mountain lions, and managed to shoot one of them. It was a handsome, large animal, so they decided to have it stuffed. But being in a rural area, they did not have the best supplies and ended up using glass buttons for its eyes. Maybe a week afterward, their farm came under attack and the chickens began disappearing nightly. Nothing worked. No bait, no traps. Nothing they tried had any success. Somebody finally stayed up one night with a gun and saw that the culprit was a mountain lion. But no number of bullets seemed to affect it. It would go in, grab a chicken, and run back out unscathed. The frequent attacks wore them down, and it began attacking during the day and frightening the family. Finally, the mother blamed the menfolk for killing that beautiful mountain lion and suspected its companion was seeking revenge. At her insistence, they left the stuffed cat outside. The next day, there was no attack, but when they went outside, they saw a pair of mountain lions standing together in the distance at the edge of the woods. As the two cats vanished into the forest, the larger one looked back briefly, and they saw that it had glass buttons instead of eyes. Story 20. I love all of this stuff. The aswang, from Filipino folklore, are half vampire, half werewolf creatures. 16th century Spanish colonists claimed they were the most feared of the folklore beings. Usually female, they can appear as cats, birds, or dogs, or otherwise remain very thin and incredibly fast. They are said to prefer eating unborn children or toddlers and favor livers and hearts. They make noises that increase in volume the farther away they are, which confuses victims. And they are also said to replace those they take with wooden copies that sicken and die, similar to folk tales about fairies. The Earl King from German poetry often whistles in the forest. He is described as wearing a cloak and luring children with trinkets and toys. He haunts ancient woods and hates the destruction of woodland. Some versions say beautiful women are granted safe passage in exchange for favors. You can protect yourself by carrying a piece of elder or alderwood. The figure is thought to originate in the Ballad of the Erlkönig. Noriona is a pale woman who haunts lonely beaches. Above the water she looks normal, but below she is half snake. She is initially seen washing her hair in the shallows and often carries a small bundle, presumed to be a baby, which she will demand you take. It is hard to refuse, but if you accept it, the bundle grows heavier and heavier until you cannot drop it. Sometimes she will pretend to drown, and when someone tries to rescue her, she will paralyze and slowly devour them. In other tellings, she is a solitary creature who simply wants to be left alone and reacts violently if disturbed. One of my favorites is Black Annis, said to haunt the hills around the Dane Hills in the United Kingdom and parts of Scotland, where some versions say her teeth are red. She is depicted with blue skin and iron claws and is notorious for preying on children. She lives in a cave or an old oak and is said to hang skins around it and to snatch people from open windows at night. You will hear her howling and the gnashing of teeth before she comes, so lock doors and windows before dark and avoid walking the hills at night. Story 21. I have gone through a lot of folklore over the years. Honestly, none of it really compares to what humans themselves do. But that is beside the point. There is an old Scottish legend about Glamis Castle. Supposedly, in 1821, the Lord and Lady of Glamis had a son. According to the official record, the boy was named Thomas Lyon Bowes, Master of Glamis, and he died the day he was born. All of this is verifiable and documented, and in fact, they were the great-grandparents of Elizabeth Bowes Lyon, more commonly known as Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, Queen Consort to King George VI of England. However, according to the legend, Thomas did not die. He lived, but as he grew, he became increasingly deformed, being described as half frog, half man. His mental state varies in the stories, with some saying he retained intelligence while others claim otherwise. He was supposedly confined to a secret room in the central tower, the doorway bricked up with only a small opening left for food. This is not as implausible as it sounds, since the castle is a 15th century fortification, and in some places the tower's walls are 16 feet thick. Rumors claim the room may have originally been a safe room or strong room. Allegedly, in the 1850s, when Thomas would have been between 29 and 39 years old, the wife of the next earl sought to resolve the matter. While her husband was out on a hunt, she asked her guests to help her. They went from room to room, opening each window and hanging something out of it, a towel, a sheet, or a handkerchief, to mark it. When they finished, it was said that one window, or in some versions, 4 windows, remained closed and unmarked. Before anything else could happen, the Earl returned, berated his wife, and soon divorced her. That divorce is a matter of record, and she later died in Italy. The striking part of the legend is that if it were true, then all of the official descendants of the First Lord were usurpers. The so-called monster would have been the legal heir, but he spent his life hidden away. Some of the more fanciful versions even claim that, in addition to his deformity, he was also ageless or immortal, and that he still lives in that bricked-up room of the castle to this day. Story 22. Unman hide and seek. I once found a list of rituals and games meant to contact the dead, and the one I still remember goes like this. Take a doll, replace its stuffing with rice, and add some of your nail clippings. Reseal the doll with red thread, tying the remainder of the thread around its body. Give the doll a name that is not your own. Turn off all the lights and leave the doll in your bathroom, submerged in a tub of water. Then say, your name is the first one to be it 3 times and leave for the room you have chosen as your hiding place. Close your eyes, count to 10, return to the bathroom and say, found you, before stabbing the doll with something sharp. Then say, doll's name is the next one to be it 3 times and run back to your hiding place. After a few minutes, you are supposed to search for the doll. It may not be where you left it. Once you find it, you say, I win 3 times and sever the red threads. After that, you must dry the doll and then burn it to complete the ritual. I am pretty sure it is from Japan, and there are likely more rules that I do not remember. You are supposed to be cautious while looking for the doll, because other things might also be in your house looking for you. Creepy stuff. There was also a game where you could speak with the dead by sitting in a dark room with mirrors on either side of you. You would say an incantation, and then 2 voices would speak to you from the mirrors. You had to keep your eyes fixed straight ahead, and you could only ask yes or no questions. If you broke any of the rules, it was said the spirits could kill you. Needless to say, I am far too scared to ever attempt either ritual. Story 23. There is a story from a province called Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in Pakistan. A girl said her aunt told her this tale. It goes like this. A man once traveled in search of his sister. He journeyed far and wide until finally reaching the town where she was said to live. When he asked the townspeople for directions, they told him she lived alone, far off in the woods. When he explained he was going to meet her because she was his blood, they tried to stop him, warning him that it was not safe. But he did not listen. What could my sister possibly do to hurt me? And why would she anyway? We are siblings, he thought. He continued on to her house, knocked on the door, and she opened it, surprised and overjoyed to see him. After they talked for a while, she told him to stay sitting on the sofa while she went into the kitchen to make tea. She insisted that he must not come into the kitchen under any circumstances. He agreed, but as night fell, he grew impatient and wondered what was taking so long. He peeked into the kitchen, and what he saw chilled him to the bone. This was not his sister at all, but a 10-foot-tall witch, a djinn, sharpening her unnaturally long nails. She was preparing to tear him apart and cook him into a stew. When she saw him standing in the doorway, she lunged at him. But he ran faster than he ever had before. He ran and never once looked back. Story 24. In Czechia, there is a figure called Polidnakes, a womanly creature who walks the fields at noon, and Klakanich, who appears around 6 in the evening when the church bells toll, warning peasants to return from the fields. She is described as a sickly, thin, deranged old woman who steals and presumably eats children who fail to return home in time. She is otherworldly and cannot be stopped. I was genuinely terrified of her because my family often spent summer afternoons at an old cabin between woods and fields near a small village. Whenever I heard the church bell at 6, I would beg my parents to go home and then watch the fields from the back of the property, determined not to let that creature get me. I even thought perhaps she was the reason the church bells rang. Another well-known figure is a version of Krampus. At the beginning of December, there is a particular day when children receive sweets, either left on the window or given in person by a trio of St. Nicholas, an angel, and a devil. Good children receive candy, naughty children receive potatoes or coal, and the worst children are put into the devil's sack and taken to hell, with both the angel and the saint in agreement. Not exactly folklore, But there was also a low-budget film released some years back called Nenasitna Tiffany, or Greedy Tiffany, which reminded me of the legends of Kelpies. The story follows a lazy man who finds a spot in the ground that produces ancient golden coins. As he digs deeper, he becomes trapped and is slowly consumed by something beneath. The protagonist manages to escape and then devises a cruel plan. He hires poor and homeless men to dig in his place, convincing them it is only mud while he collects the coins above. Story 25. The first story is of the Donkey Lady. Legend says that in the late 1800s, a woman and her family were caught in a fire at their house. Her husband and 2 children perished in the flames, but she survived. Her legs and hands were burned to stumps, and her face became horribly disfigured. Driven insane, she became known as the Donkey Lady. Near the outskirts of my city, there is a place called Donkey Lady Bridge, where she is said to roam. If you go there at night, you might hear screaming and howling in the dark. One tale describes a father and his 2 sons camping near the bridge. As they set up their tent, they heard rustling in the tall grass, followed by snorting sounds as if a large animal approached. Alarmed, the father told his sons to pack up quickly. As they tried to leave, something leapt onto their truck, smashing at the windshield. The father slammed the brakes, throwing the creature off, but it chased them as they drove away until finally disappearing. The family later described the thing as hideous and malformed, with the appearance of a donkey. Another legend is of the haunted railroad tracks. In the 1960s, a bus full of school children was struck by a train, and no one survived. Today, if you park your car in neutral on those tracks, it is said that children's ghosts push you to safety. People even sprinkle baby powder on their cars to reveal ghostly handprints. When I was 5 years old, my family went to test it. As soon as our car stopped, it rolled off the tracks by itself. I was terrified. Ghosts were the last thing I wanted to think about at that age. Years later, a program on the Sci-Fi Channel claimed to debunk the phenomenon with science, but the legend persists. Of course, everyone has heard of La Llorona, but in Mexican culture, especially in South Texas, there is also La Chusa. In Spanish, chusa means owl, and La Chusa is believed to be a witch who transforms into a massive bird at night to terrorize the living. My grandmother taught me that when you hear wings flapping, cackling, or whistling, a La Chusa is near. To drive it away, you must curse at it loudly, showing no fear. If you are brave enough, you can take out rosary beads and recite the Our Father backwards, which will send the bird crashing to the ground in agony. My father shared a story from when he was a teenager. He used to sneak out at night to see my mother, who lived nearby. One night walking home, he heard wings and whistling overhead. Looking up, he saw the biggest bird he had ever encountered, following him from pole to pole. He ran straight home, locked the door, and peeked outside. But the creature lingered. He did not realize my grandmother was waiting inside, furious at him for being out late. She scolded him with her belt, and when he explained about the La Chusa, she stormed outside, belt in hand, and cursed at the monstrous bird until it left. Then she turned back to him and said, "That is what you get, pendejo." Story 26. This story is from America, though I have no idea where I first heard it, but it creeped me out. I think it is called the Montana Man, or something similar. A Montana teacher and football coach once told his students about when he used to work at a smaller college. After practice one night, he left in his old pickup truck, driving past wide fields of grain. That is when he noticed a hitchhiker waving him down. In those days, it was normal to stop, so he did. The man was wearing an outdated suit, almost like a zoot suit, with a large hat, as if he had stepped out of the 1940s. The teacher thought it odd that he was so overdressed, considering how humid the night was, but he let him into the truck. The man sat silently while the teacher tried to make conversation. He asked, "Where are you headed?" But the hitchhiker said nothing, only pointed straight ahead and then pulled his hat lower as if pretending to sleep. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the man yelled for the teacher to stop the car. The first words he had spoken. The teacher pulled over, and the man got out, standing silently by the road for a few minutes before sprinting into the tall grain fields and vanishing from sight. The teacher waited a moment, thinking the man might return, but he never did. He got back into his truck and started driving, but soon saw something horrifying in his rearview mirror. The hitchhiker was behind him, running on all fours in a twisted, unnatural way, moving at an inhuman speed. The truck began to fishtail as the man chased after it, crawling and sprinting like an animal. The teacher pressed harder on the gas until he finally picked up enough speed to lose him. Shaken, he stopped at the first gas station he found and called his wife, telling her to lock the house. She thought he was joking, but later he spoke with one of her colleagues who told him there had been similar reports in the area. The man had apparently been picked up many times before. The question is, was the Montana man ever really human? Story 27. Romani people have long been perceived as possessing secret knowledge of mystical arts and an affinity for maledictions, curses believed to bring terrible consequences. Many non-Romani assume that if they do not appease us or pay for another fortune, we might speak a dark incantation to summon misfortune. Romani religion is in truth a blend, a syncretism shaped by centuries of diaspora, combining elements of faiths and folklore encountered across Europe. Hungarian Romani castes practice the crafting of amulets and talismans, believed to carry good luck or special gifts for the bearer. The Cale castes of England hold that water is sacred, and to spill it wastefully is profane. They honor a water goddess by blessing their water before drinking it. Much Romani folklore was destroyed during World War II, with what remains softened and altered to seem more palatable to outsiders. Many people believe absurd superstitions about Romani culture, such as that ominous predictions are actually curses. Being a nomadic and obscure people invited these suspicions from native Europeans, and unfortunately even some of our own perpetuate these stereotypes because so much of our culture was erased by the Nazis. The allure of mysticism has also allowed less scrupulous individuals to exploit outsiders by playing into those beliefs, which has contributed to a reputation of mistrust. In truth, much of our folklore, once rich and complex, now survives only in fragments, leaving outsiders to fill the gaps with fear and fantasy. Story 28. This was back in Asmara, Eritrea, when I was around 4 to 7 years old. My uncle, who was about 16 at the time, used to go up onto a nearby mountain-like hill that levels out by Sembol and mess around with a slingshot. I remember going with him one day and seeing a full glass building right after the mountain. Literally all 4 walls made of glass. There were no nearby houses or anything else, and if I remember correctly, there was no floor inside. It was so strange it went straight down. He used to scare me by saying a dark figure on a black horse lived there. I went back some days later with friends to show them the glass house. When we got there, the glass was broken, apparently with rocks, so we did our childish thing and smashed a little more with our slingshots. We went home and forgot about it. A few weeks later, my uncle was coming back from the mountain with his friend Sammy limping behind him. When they got close, I noticed Sammy's right leg was coated in a dark, coal-like texture. Imagine a burnt branch, blackened and charred. That was his leg. I did not know what it was. My uncle explained they were chased by the dark figure on the black horse and that it had grabbed Sammy's leg while they ran, leaving that mark. I believed him because, well, what else could it be? It looked so real. I kept seeing Sammy limping for weeks after that. I cannot remember what eventually happened to him. I later escaped the country's dictatorship. My uncle is a trucker now in America. I'm going to give him a call for sure. I need answers. I had forgotten all about it until this question reminded me. Story 29. I am an archaeologist and work in a small Maya community in the Lacandon jungle. They have extensive folkloric traditions, and one of the spookier ones that stuck with me is about Laxtabai, pronounced Ishtabai, a female demon who stalks and kills men in the jungle and can shapeshift into a snake, a cactus, or a ceiba tree. One of the nearby archaeological sites is called Ixtabai, and she is said to roam the jungle around that site, which sits isolated on an island in the lake. Once I bought a ceramic figure of a 2-headed jaguar from their sister village, and the next day, back in town, a village elder stopped us and warned to watch out for 2-headed jaguars in the jungle. He did not know I had just bought the figure, which was unnerving. I suddenly felt very worried about cat-like predators. Finally, my partner, who is also an archaeologist working in the same village, told me about an evening when he and a few others were eating late and decided to walk by the lake. They saw what looked like the beam of a flashlight bobbing around in a swampy, rain-flooded area of the jungle. But when they called out, there was no answer and nobody was walking. The light moved unnaturally and then disappeared when they approached. They heard no footsteps or splashing to match it. Apparently, those lights are spirits that wander the unoccupied parts of the jungle near the archaeological sites. I think they have a name in Maya, but for the life of me, I cannot recall it. Story 30. I heard this story from my grandma when my parents and I were visiting her recently. There was an old house in her neighborhood that has since been demolished, now just land for crops. A single father lived there with his young daughter after the mother left him for a wealthy man and moved abroad. The man soon became mentally ill, plagued with hallucinations. One night, while off his medication, he pulled his 9-year-old daughter from her bed as she slept and threw her into the oven, killing her. He then hanged himself in the garage. They were discovered in the morning by the girl's aunt, who had come to check on them, knowing he had stopped taking his medicine. When construction workers came years later to tear the house down, they reported a strong smell of burned flesh. One worker suffered such a severe panic attack that an ambulance was called. No one could explain how such a smell lingered so long after the tragedy, especially with the house being demolished many years later. It is the saddest and most disturbing story I have ever heard, and I still remember my grandma's expression as she told it, while speaking about her village and how she grew up there. It left me shaken, realizing how deeply marriage problems and despair can destroy lives. Story 31. There is a cemetery in Argentina that is both beautiful and eerie. It spans 234 acres, filled with alleys, crypts, and mystery. It was created in 1871 to hold the countless victims of a yellow fever epidemic. So many perished that the cemetery became one of the largest in the world and the largest in Buenos Aires. Among the many stories told within its walls, one stands out, the tale of the ghastly taxi. Around 1978, local newspapers reported that a woman was found dead, lying on her mother's tomb. She was said to have taken the taxi of death. According to legend, this taxi sometimes appears in the line of cabs outside the cemetery. Some claim it is an old Ford Falcon, others an old Peugeot, but all agree on the license plate, RIP 666. Those who dare to ride in this cab feel odd chills creeping through their body, starting gentle and growing colder, more paralyzing, until they cannot scream. The driver does not respond and keeps driving. The doors are locked and there is no escape. The ride always ends where it began, back at the cemetery, but the passenger never comes out alive. Story 32. My aunt told me this story when I visited family in Stambaugh, Michigan, just north of the Wisconsin border. In the late 1800s, a mob boss ran a one-stop den for gambling, prostitution, booze, and drugs. He chained wild wolves outside the building, using them as enforcers. Anyone who crossed him, especially the women he enslaved, was thrown to the wolves. Eventually, the townspeople rose up, burned the building, and drove him out of town. Even after the building was gone, people claimed they could still hear the wolves howling. The site sat in a swamp on the town's edge. According to legend, if you walk into the swamp on a misty night or during a full moon, while the wolves are howling, you may encounter the ghost of a woman with tattered clothes and flesh torn by wolf bites. She begs for help, and if you agree, she will lead you deeper into the swamp, where you vanish forever. If you refuse, a pack of wolves will emerge and kill you where you stand. Some say it is just wolves, but whether ghostly or not, wandering into that swamp on a night filled with howls is dangerous all the same. Story 33. In the hills above a salt town where the air was always a little sharp and the grass tasted mineral on your tongue, there was a footbridge made of old planks and rock salt blocks that the villagers called the Bride's Crossing. Because on foggy evenings, people swore they saw a woman in a plain shawl waiting there, hands folded, eyes lowered, as if she had been standing in patient silence since the first bell tower was raised. My grandmother said you should pass quietly and keep a pinch of salt in your pocket for luck. And if you had none, you were to borrow it from the earth itself and thank Mother Ground aloud so she knew you meant no harm. I learned all of this during a summer when my cousin and I were sent to help a beekeeper whose hive sat near the salt marsh. He believed in practical things like smoke and patience and the right weather for honey, but he also believed, as most practical people do, that it is wise to follow the rules of a place. When the fog came down off the ridge one evening and the bell in the valley struck the hour, he handed us a wrapped loaf and a jar we were to take to a widow beyond the bridge, and he told us plainly to walk in single file. eyes on the boards, no looking over the side into the pale brine trickling beneath, because the woman in the shawl disliked being met head-on and would draw you into conversation that never quite ended. We laughed exactly once, the way young people laugh when they are not ready to admit the back of their neck is starting to feel watched, then set out with our gifts. The marsh birds were quiet except for the occasional wing beat somewhere inside the fog, a soft thrum like a hand on a drum. And when we reached the middle of the bridge, the air turned cold in the way cellars are cold, steady, and joint deep. And there she was, not gorgeous and not monstrous, but ordinary. In that unsettling way, old photographs make ordinary faces look like witnesses. She never raised her eyes, only asked if we had brought her something, which felt like a trick because the bread and honey were for the widow. So I said, "I can offer you thanks," and took the salt from my pocket and scattered it into the brine below. Beside me, my cousin did the same, and the woman sighed as if she had been carrying something heavy, and we had allowed her to set it down. Then she told us a story without lifting her head, about a worker who died in the mine when a beam gave way, and how she came to the bridge each evening to wait for a man who promised he would return before the bell finished ringing and did not, and how the taste of the air never left her mouth after that, so she could not eat bread or honey without wanting the sharpness of salt. We stood perfectly still, listening until the bell in the valley sounded once more, and the fog thinned like breath on glass. When it cleared, the bridge was empty in front of us, and the boards were dry, as if no one had stood there at all. We delivered our parcel, and the widow asked whether we had remembered to thank the water, and when we nodded, she smiled in a way that made me think of the woman with the lowered eyes and the weight she had laid down for a moment. On our way back, we left a small twist of salt on the rail and walked in silence, feeling watched in a kind way, the way a mother watches a child cross a stream. Story 34. Along the estuary, where reeds tick against one another like teeth and the tide pulls secrets into mud, there is a story the net menders tell about the lantern man who walks the banks on nights when the moon hangs low and the flats shine like the backs of sleeping fish. The old men say he is not a man at all, but something that wears the idea of a man the way a marsh wears fog, thin and convincing enough until you try to grasp it. My uncle kept a skiff and taught me to steer by church lights in the shadowed belfry, but he taught me other things in the same measured voice. How to turn your pockets inside out if the fire on the water begins to hop in invitation. How to carry a crumb of bread and a silver token to pay whatever tax the night demands. How to never whistle on the tide because it calls up listeners you cannot see. One evening the wind failed and left the estuary flat and mirror still, and we poled into a back channel to lift a pot gone heavy. The rope came up clean as if hands had wiped it, the pot empty, and in the mirror of the water a lantern bobbed behind us, where there was no bank, only reflected sky. My uncle did not look back. He told me gently to set the oar and count 20 strokes without stopping, and to name with each stroke something I had loved that day, so my mouth would be too busy for answering calls. I said bread and mended nets, and the way the dogs sneezed in sun dust, and the lantern drifted closer, a warm little moon lighting the reeds from their feet up, and with it came the soft sound of someone walking where there was nowhere to walk. I could feel questions rising in me the way minnows rise in sudden silver, but my uncle shook his head, and I remembered the rule about not answering things you cannot see. When the 20th stroke fell, he set the silver token onto the water, and it did not sink, only pressed a neat dimpling circle, and the lantern paused the way a bird pauses when it hears a different song. He told whatever walked there that we were only passing and had nothing it wanted, and for a moment the light burned so steady I could have read by it. I saw then that the lantern glass was not glass at all, but water burning from within, and the hand that held it seemed to be made of the same slow current. We slid on until the church light lined up with the far elm, and then, like a candle pinched, the glow went out. Later on the bank, the men told us about a poacher who ignored the rules and whistled for luck on a spring tide, how the lantern man had led him through shallows that were not shallows and left him standing on a bar that looked like shore until the tide returned and turned the map upside down. It is a small story, modest as a mud snail's track, but I have never whistled on water since, and I always keep a crumb and a coin where my hand can find them in the dark.